So I'm a male nurse at a large hospital in San Francisco. I work in the ER, and as is custom Thanksgiving night, it was very busy. Now my wife is also a nurse for the same hospital. She works in labor and delivery. Between babies being born left and right, and the people coming into the ER, we hadn't had a chance to take a break together as we tried to do every shift. So when she called, I figured it was to say she wanted to meet up for a bite to eat in the cafeteria. When I answered, I heard in the background a male voice screaming profanities, and my wife, who is fluent in Spanish, trying to calm this guy down. She told me their pager wasn't working and they needed security stats. I quickly hung up, called for security, told my fellow nurses what was going on, and ran for labor and delivery, worried sick about my wife, when I ran almost square smack dab into this visibly angry man. He wasn't huge, but bro definitely worked out and not at the gym. He was covered in prison tattoos, and he was obviously a banger. I work out regularly, but I knew this guy could kick my ass. He looked at me, gave me this sick grin, and started heading towards me, sprouting off in Spanish. I don't speak fluent Spanish, but what I could understand scared the living shit out of me. I'm backing up as fast as I can. I start buzzing the door to the ER frantically for them to let me in. This guy is literally a foot away from me and the door opens and I'm pulled into safety by a doctor. Gangbanger punches the door a few times and makes a dragging sign across his throat, while grinning at us both. Next thing I know, the police rush into the corridor he's in, and it takes 2 security officers and 2 cops to subdue this dude. I finally make it to my wife, who thankfully was shaken up but unhurt. She explained to me what happened. A young girl, only 14, came in with a high fever, vomiting, and a distended belly. The banger claimed he was her brother, and they needed to cut her open to get her baby. They did an ultrasound, and to their horror, they realized she wasn't pregnant. She had bags of drugs in her stomach. It's very common for drug mules to bring over young women from Mexico carrying drugs that way. Homeboy freaked out when they informed him his sister needed emergency surgery. And no, he wasn't getting his drugs. Thankfully, the girl survived, but the sad thing is she will most likely be deported once she recovers. Last Thanksgiving, I was driving home from college with my friends, both 21-year-old females at the time. I live in a very isolated part of Arkansas that requires driving through an hour of hairpin turns in the mountains. There are lots of blind turns, and the whole time you're driving on the edge of huge drop-offs with no barriers. I'm usually pretty confident driving through the mountains, but we were in my friend's car, so I was going slower than usual, driving about 5 over the speed limit. Almost as soon as we started the roughest part of the drive, another car was tailgating us pretty close. This was stressing me out, and as soon as I saw somewhere I could pull over, I did. I pulled into a church parking lot, and my friend offered to drive the rest of the way, but I declined as it was completely dark and she had never driven this route before. We get back on our way, and a few minutes later I have to come to a screeching halt, as there's a car stopped in the middle of the road. It wasn't on the shoulder at all. It just stopped dead in the middle of the road. My friend is saying that they must have broken down but can't call a tow because there's no service in this area. I immediately have a bad feeling and lock the doors. I tell my friend to stay in the car no matter what. She is starting to get scared at this point and points out that she thinks it was the car that was following us. I can't tell, but I am very scared at this point. It's parked right before a hairpin turn, so I can't pass it. My friend starts frantically telling me to go ahead and pass it, but I don't want to get hit by a Mack truck or fall off the mountain. I honk my horn. Nothing happens. There is no chance of calling for help as there is no cell service. We wait there for a while doing nothing. My friend is crying and freaking out, but I'm too scared to try to pass them. I honk a couple times, and eventually a guy gets out of the car, comes around back, and leans against his car just staring at us. My friend is freaking out even more, and I'm just frozen. I tell her not to make eye contact. I'm ready to floor it if he does something, but he just stands there staring. He's not checking his car or anything. I try to stay calm and pray that another car will come along soon. This goes on for what seems like forever, but was probably 15 plus minutes. He's just casually leaning against his car looking at us. Eventually we see car lights in our rear view, and then the guy jogs to his door and gets back in his car. He speeds off, going dangerously fast, so there was nothing wrong with his car. I start driving, not wanting to cause a wreck. We don't see anything else for a while, but we pass the same car parked along the highway a while later, and it pulls back on and starts tailing us again. I try to speed up and get rid of him, but he keeps following. We have cell service at this point, but I don't know if we should call the cops because nothing really happened. I call home and tell my brothers what was going on and tell them to wait on the porch for us. The car follows me all the way home, down the really long drive to my house. I get to my house and my two brothers are waiting on the porch holding their deer rifles. I pull in and the car just goes to the end of the drive, loops around, and speeds off back the way it came. We tried to see its plates, but we couldn't make them out. Me and my friend were really freaked out, but when I told other friends the whole story, they didn't think it was a big deal. So the story starts in 2006, back when MySpace was very popular. My little sister was very active on the site, remaking her profile, adding, and chatting with random people daily. She started telling her friends she has a boyfriend named Marcus in Atlanta, and when his family comes to visit other family members, they would meet up. We lived in a small suburb outside of Chicago called Sauk Village. I scolded her about telling random people where we live and how dangerous it was. She stated she only told him what town it was, not like he could immediately find her. They continued speaking via MySpace and eventually texted into 2007 when Marcus informed her he and his family would be in Chicago and that they should definitely meet up to hang. She agreed, but never spoke a word about it to anyone. The Friday spring break was set to start. I made it in the house after school and started my chores. It was weird because she would usually get home at the same time as me, as high school let out at 2:45 and she got out at 3:15. By 5 p.m. I noticed she still had not come home. I went searching for her, leaving the back door unlocked just in case she popped up while I was gone. I went to her friend's house, who stayed 2 blocks away, and they said, the last time we saw her was when school let out and we were walking down the trail. I checked with other friends, and they all confirmed they had not seen her. I got that weird feeling like static running from my ears to my feet, so I jumped the back gate and ran into my back door. I continued calling my sister's phone and family members, then I heard the computer ping. I noticed she was still logged into MySpace, so I read her messages, thinking maybe there would be a clue there. The first few messages were her friends telling her I was looking for her, and she needed to get home before she got in trouble, but the fourth down was Marcus. The message read, "Baby, I'm on your block. I just saw you jump that fence. Why are you hiding from me?" I was shook. What did he mean? He saw her jump a fence, so I read through their thread, and to my horror I realized that she had sent him pictures with the both of us in them, and never clarified which one she was. Our mother didn't allow her to post pictures of herself on her profile, so it was very easy to assume she was whomever you wanted her to be. While I was reading through the thread, I heard a car door slam, 2 male voices approaching my front door, and then I heard beating on my window. I go to my window since its light taps, and I can hear my sister's voice urging me to open the window. I open the window. She slides in and turns off the light, pulling my hand into the closet with her. She said Marcus is not 13 like he said. He is old, like at least 31. He saw me and asked where my sister was, so I've been avoiding the house. I scolded her and said she should have come home first. The banging on the door grew more intense, then I heard footsteps on the back patio. I panicked because I couldn't remember if I locked the door or not. Just then my question was answered. I took out my phone and called the police. After I whispered the address to the dispatcher, I heard a voice say, "Baby, where are you?" With a sinister laugh to follow. A crack of light shone through the closet, which meant he was in my room. Tears started streaming down my sister's face. Then the person in the car started beeping the horn crazy. He ran out of the house, and I heard tires peel off. Too scared to move, I put the phone back in my ear, and the operator said, "The police are outside." I refused to move. Actually, my legs refused to move. The police came downstairs and said, "Ladies, it's okay to come out now the house is all clear." We ran out to jump on the officer. We printed all the messages and gave her login info to the investigators. The person left fingerprints on the door and wall, so they had fingerprints. We didn't hear too much after that. Fast forward to 2018. I'm on Facebook and I posted a transformation picture of my sis and me in a group. Then I went to work. When I got off, I had a message from someone named Marcus saying, "You got away once, but I will get you next time." I immediately put a request in to delete my profile. A few years ago, I was doing a high school project where I had to interview a figure I looked up to in my life about a trying time in their life. Naturally, I chose a grandma-like figure in my life, Marie. who took care of me a lot when I was growing up. She was a robust, 95-year-old double amputee. With red hair, she would die every Friday, though she would never dare admit it. She lived in the same small town as me, alone in a small house on the edge of town after her late husband, Quinn, passed years ago. Marie had no kids or living relatives, except a niece that tried to poison her. So when her friend, my mom, had kids, she adopted me as one of her own. So when I asked if I could interview her, she was delighted, and we were scheduled to meet next week for a few hours. When that day came, I arrived to see that she had brought out pictures of her and her husband in Honduras years ago, fixating on one of them standing together in a river clearing. This is where her and our story will begin. Marie and Quinn used to live in the northern United States, where they were married and stayed happily for many years. Until one day, Quinn told her that they would be moving to Honduras for his job, and so they did. They moved into a large house on the outskirts of a small village with a river out back, deep in the forests of Honduras. For the majority of their time there, she stayed in the house, traveling out only with Quinn after she learned her lesson the first time. She then went into a story about how one day, out of curiosity, she went out alone to a public meeting that went on once every week that she always heard people talking about. When she got to the center of the village, she discovered to her horror that these meetings were not public gatherings for discussions, but rather public executions. She painted an image of everyone in the village gathered around a large platform where a few unlucky souls were lined up and taken one by a large man. She described him as a hulking mass of muscles with scars covering his body, with a massive one across his face. The stern figure would take each person one at a time, force them to their knees, and then take a large rusty hatchet and fulfill his name of the Hatchet Man. After seeing this, Marie would retreat home and stay indoors for months, only leaving on special occasions, such as when she would be escorted out to a nearby large house to tell her husband something important. Upon arrival, she was taken to some stairs and down a large hallway. When she entered the door at the end, she found her husband with several other men in suits that she described as Honduran officials, playing poker with a bathtub full of money in the room. Quinn scolded her for coming to find him, and she returned home. The next morning, she was sitting outside on her porch when a jaguar came down and started to drink from the river. She sat and watched it for what she said felt like hours. Before leaving, it looked at her and ran off. She then got the feeling that it was time to leave. Coincidentally, the next week she was woken up in her room by a family friend in the middle of the night, expressing to her that something went wrong and that she needed to get out now. The woman handed her a note from Quinn that said that a coup had broken out and that she is not safe here anymore and must leave before sunrise. The letter continued by detailing directions to a field where a plane will be waiting to take her to a town in the southern United States with only an address. She tried finding Quinn but couldn't, and with only an hour before dawn, she headed to the field. When she arrived, she saw a large, empty, knee-high grass pasture with a small two-person plane sitting in the middle. She approached the plane with only the guidance of a dim candle, and just when she was about to board, she felt two firm taps on her shoulder. Marie turned around to see a large figure looming behind her, the Hatchet Man. She described being immobilized with fear as a trickle ran down her leg, but before she could yell for help, the Hatchet Man said in a low voice, No, Miss Marie, don't scream. I am here to make sure you get on this plane safe." She got on the plane and left Honduras, never to return. She went to a small house on the edge of a small town and would not hear from her husband for several months, until one day when he randomly arrived at the door with flowers. Marie would later develop cervical cancer and have her reproductive organs removed, keeping her and Quinn from ever having kids. Though this, and even an eventual double amputation, didn't stop her from having a family, befriending a woman, and taking in that woman's kids as her own. She would die roughly 20 years later, leaving everything to her kids. When I was 15 years old, I lived in a rural area about 20 minutes outside of the actual town I called home. I was home from school alone one day, and a white car pulled up in front of our mailbox and stopped. I was upstairs in my room and saw from the window, but could not see who was in the car. Whoever it was sat there for several minutes without getting out of the vehicle, long enough to weird me out, and then drove away. We weren't super close in distance to our neighbors, but we weren't miles and miles apart, and I remembered that one neighbor a bit down was selling their house. I chalked it up to a potential buyer having the wrong address, or simply checking out the neighborhood, and thought nothing else of it. Fast forward about a week or so, it was a Friday night, and I had gone downtown to see the premiere of a movie with my boyfriend at the time. And I had begged my parents consistently for weeks to push back my curfew so I could see this movie, since it wouldn't be over until after 1 a.m. and it took 20 minutes to get home from town. They were reluctant, but finally agreed. When the movie was over, my boyfriend Jason and I walked slowly to the truck. It was a well-lit and relatively safe area, so we stood around in the parking deck, trying to push curfew for as long as possible. There weren't many vehicles at that time of night, but I realized suddenly that I recognized the one parked straight across from us. The same white car that had been at my house a week earlier. The car was running, and there was a man, maybe mid-30s, sitting alone inside. I could have passed this all off as a coincidence, except as I continued to look at him, he turned his bright lights on us and spun out of the parking deck after almost running into Jason's truck. I obviously had a horrible feeling about this and asked Jason to take me home immediately. As we pulled out of the garage, we saw the car parked across the street from the movie theater. All the lights off. A man still inside. But he didn't follow us, so we just went home a little shaken. I had no idea at that moment. This was the start of 3 long and torturous years of being stalked by this man. A couple months after the parking deck situation, the encounters became more frequent and weirder, and I hated being anywhere alone at any time. I never knew when and where I would see him or how much time would pass between encounters. It became clear that he was watching me all the time by this point because he only made himself known when I was alone or with my boyfriend. Never my parents or even other friends. I became terrified, for some stupid reason, that none of my friends would believe me if I told them, so I kept it between Jason and my family. Until one day my friend Rachel, who lived maybe 5 miles away from me, started telling me about this creepy man who showed up at her house over the weekend. Rachel's dad works Saturdays, so she was home alone with another friend of ours, Megan. Everything was normal until around dusk, when they began to smell cigarette smoke. My heart instantly began racing because, by this time, this was becoming an everyday occurrence for me. I was smelling cigarette smoke, finding cigarette butts around my house, even though none of my family smoked, and could never trace the source. I had a nagging feeling, of course, that it was connected to my stalker but hadn't confirmed. So as Rachel and Megan were looking for the source of the smoke, Rachel realized she had left a window in a back room open and the smoke was coming in from the back porch. Seeing that there was a strange man on her porch, she quickly goes to close and lock the window, and, in her words, he turns around with dead eyes and looks straight through her like she wasn't really there. Megan immediately called the police, but Rachel continued to stand there in a little bit of shock as he smirked at her and stared until his cigarette was done. He then got up and calmly walked away. The police came but found no trace of him except for cigarette butts on the porch, and scattered around the backyard, indicating he had been there for quite some time. I immediately began to describe the creep to Rachel, and it was the same man. She hadn't seen or heard the white car at all, and they guessed that he had parked down the road and walked down Rachel's almost mile-long driveway or through the woods a bit. As time went on, my stories were well documented with the police department, but they had never even seen the guy. He was so good at getting away. I have to give them credit because they never doubted the truth in my stories and always showed up quickly. Even as it was becoming apparent that this guy knew what he was doing and wasn't planning to be caught anytime soon. We also began to suspect he had a police scanner in his car. One night in particular, almost 2 years after the Rachel incident, Jason and I were coming home a little early from a date. My parents had gone out as well that night, and we had a strict rule that we couldn't be home alone with no adults. So Jason and I began to talk in the driveway since my dad had called and they were only about 10 minutes away. We were too scared, given the circumstances, to get out of the truck. And we kept our eyes peeled for the creep, but we figured 10 minutes wasn't all that long. Sure as the world. Not even a minute later, we saw headlights turned on in the bushes across the street from my driveway. This freak had backed his car into the bushes and waited for us to come home. Jason immediately got on the phone with the cops, and I called my dad, who was literally flying home at this point, as the man revved up his engine and flashed his lights. He then proceeded to get out of his car and walk toward Jason's truck. I will never forget, he was so slow, methodical, and emotionless. It felt like I was living out a serial killer movie. I was sobbing. We had the doors locked, of course, as the man walked up to the passenger side, where I was sitting and stood only a couple feet away from my window, staring at me. He never made a move for the door. He simply stood completely still and stared. He held eye contact with me with his eyes like black holes. Jason was a baseball player and had been keeping a bat in the back seat exactly for a moment like this. He pulled me toward him and away from the window and grabbed the bat. But this man didn't even flinch. He switched his gaze to the bat for a few seconds. smiled this huge and disgusting grin, walked back to his car and drove away. It seemed like 40 minutes passed, but it couldn't have been more than 5 because the man was gone for a couple minutes before my dad came into our driveway doing like 80 miles per hour. The cops never caught up to him. There were many more stories of torture, such as leaving dead animals outside of our front door and shining flashlights into our windows in the middle of the night. But nothing anyone did could trip this guy up. My family had tried everything. My older brother had even desperately tried to chase the guy through the woods behind our house one night and lost him. The police wanted to help, but they only had my stories and the corroboration of my boyfriend, Rachel's encounter, and one kind of vague sighting of the car in town. I didn't even have a name for anyone to file a restraining order against. Not that it would have done me any good. And maybe the creepiest part of all of this, in 3 whole years, he never spoke a single word. Then one day, just as quickly as he showed up, every single trace of him completely disappeared. Just like that. I never knew if he died, was arrested for some other crime, or just lost interest, even though that seemed highly unlikely. I just simply never saw him again, and it has now been 10 years. Creeps come in all shapes and forms, and many times do not look like what you see in the movies. They can seem completely normal on the outside. However, this man's behavior was exactly like something from a horror film. Something in his eyes was so evil it would turn your stomach. Over the course of 3 years, he made my life extremely stressful and terrifying, and even now that I live in a different state, I sometimes halfway expect him to show up again,